Gideon stood in the freezing mud of the lower corral, staring down at the collapsed crossbeam he no longer had the strength to lift. The Wyoming wind bit deeply through his worn canvas coat, but the real cold came from the sudden, bitter realization that his 54-year-old body was finally giving out. If he could not mend the winter holding pens, the cattle would scatter and freeze. If the cattle froze, the bank would take the land his father had bled to keep. His right shoulder burned with a deep, grinding ache he had stubbornly hidden from the town for 2 long years. He reached down, gripping the wet timber with cold, stiffened fingers, and pulled. His shoulder gave way with a sickening pop, dropping him instantly to his knees in the icy mud. He was entirely alone, and the harsh winter was coming fast. He was still breathing hard, trying to get his legs under him, when the sharp crack of snapping wood and the sound of a laboring draft horse echoed off the ridge. Up on the muddy wagon road, a heavy freight wagon sat tilted at a sharp, unnatural angle. The rear axle had split clean through. A figure climbed down from the driver's bench and began walking down the steep switchback toward Gideon's cabin. As the stranger drew closer, Gideon blinked, wiping freezing rain from his eyes. It was a woman, but she was built on a scale he had never seen in all his years on the western frontier. She stood at least 6 feet 5 inches tall, with shoulders as broad as a seasoned blacksmith. She wore a faded dark green canvas work dress, reinforced heavily at the seams, and a sturdy canvas apron that was already mud-splattered at the hem. Her thick forearms, exposed where she had practically rolled back her sleeves, were corded with natural, heavy muscle. She moved with a grounded, powerful rhythm, her large leather work boots sinking deep into the wet earth with every confident step. "Axle gave out on the grade," she called out. Her voice was steady, calm, and held absolutely no panic. "Name is Esther. I need a dry place for my team tonight, and I can pay for my keep in heavy labor until the stage comes through on Thursday. Have you ever reached a point where you realized you could no longer carry a heavy burden alone, and help arrived exactly when you needed it? Leave a comment sharing your story." Gideon straightened up, carefully hiding his wince as he cradled his throbbing right arm against his ribs. He did not stare at her immense height. He did not make a cruel joke about her size, the way most men in town usually did. He simply looked at the quiet capability in her warm hazel eyes and gave a slow, respectful nod. "I'm Gideon. I've got room in the lower barn for your team." Esther's gaze drifted past him to the collapsed corral fencing. Looks like you could use a hand clearing that timber before it freezes to the mud." Gideon's jaw tightened. A cowboy's pride was a stubborn, foolish thing, often the absolute last piece of a man to break. "I can manage it," he lied, his voice gravelly with exhaustion. Esther stepped calmly into the corral. She did not argue or try to soothe his fragile ego. She simply walked up to the thick, waterlogged beam that had just driven Gideon to his knees. She planted her sturdy boots firmly, bent her thick knees, and gripped the timber with massive, calloused hands. She didn't grunt or strain wildly. She just took a deep breath, engaged her incredibly powerful torso, and stood up. The heavy beam rose from the mud with a loud, wet suction sound. She hoisted it onto her broad shoulder like it was nothing more than a split piece of cordwood, walked it over to the scrap pile, and dropped it with a heavy thud. Gideon watched in absolute silence. He felt a strange, immediate sense of relief. He was not threatened by her extraordinary physical strength. He was deeply, profoundly grateful for it. "I appreciate that," he said quietly, his voice lacking any edge of resentment. Esther turned, genuinely surprised by his gentle tone. She was completely used to men puffing out their chests, making harsh remarks, or scrambling to prove they were stronger than she was. But this graying, weathered cattleman just looked at her with honest, practical respect. "There's a heavy iron coffee pot simmering on the stove inside," Gideon offered, gesturing toward the smoking chimney of the cabin. "Should be hot enough to strip paint by now. You're welcome to a cup once we get your horses settled." They worked side by side in the freezing drizzle, unhitching her massive draft horses and leading them into the dry, sweet-smelling barn. They did not speak much, but the silence between them was remarkably easy. It was the comfortable silence of two people who understood the brutal, unforgiving nature of frontier labor. Later, as they sat at the small wooden table near the hearth, wrapping their hands around tin cups of black coffee, Gideon watched the firelight catch the natural lines around Esther's face. She was a woman who knew what it meant to work until her bones ached. For the first time in years, the crushing weight of the ranch did not feel entirely unmanageable. But Thursday was only 3 days away. When the stagecoach came, she would be ready to leave. Gideon took a slow sip of his bitter coffee, wondering if his stubborn pride would ever allow him to look this powerful, capable woman in the eye and admit that he needed her to stay. The Wyoming frost had painted the grass a brittle white by the time Gideon stepped onto the porch the next morning. His right shoulder throbbed with a dull heat, a grim reminder of his failing strength. He had expected to find his ranch locked in the frozen stillness of early winter. Instead, he heard the rhythmic, heavy thud of a wooden maul striking timber. He walked toward the lower holding pens, his breath pluming in the frigid air. Esther was already at work. She had shed her heavy canvas coat, working only in her faded green dress and heavy apron despite the biting cold. She was sinking new cedar posts into the freezing mud, hoisting the massive waterlogged logs with a grounding rhythm that made the brutal labor look like a simple chore. Gideon leaned against the top rail, watching her with quiet disbelief. She didn't swing the heavy fencing maul with reckless haste. She used the immense natural power of her broad shoulders and thick torso, driving the posts deep with calculated efficiency. It wasn't just her physical strength that caught his attention. A nervous young roan gelding, easily spooked by sudden movements, was pacing anxiously near the broken fence. Most green hands would have shouted or waved their hats to drive it back. Esther simply stopped working. She lowered the heavy maul, stood perfectly still, and spoke in a low, rumbling voice that vibrated through the damp air. She reached out with one of her massive, calloused hands, resting it gently against the gelding's neck. The horse stopped pacing, blowing out a long breath, anchored entirely by her calm presence. Gideon felt a tight knot of worry loosen in his chest. She wasn't just a laborer. She possessed the quiet, instinctual competence of someone who belonged to the land. He walked over to help her measure out the next section of wire. They fell into a comfortable, unspoken rhythm. Gideon marked the lines using his good left arm, while Esther handled the heavy pulling. For the first time in years, the crushing loneliness of maintaining the ranch vanished. As they worked, Gideon noticed that the handle of the heavy wooden maul was slightly too narrow for Esther's extraordinarily large hands, forcing her to overgrip the worn wood. When they paused to let the draft horses drink, Gideon quietly took the maul to the tack room. He didn't make a fuss. He found a thick strip of oiled harness, leather, and tightly wrapped the handle, widening the grip to properly match the massive span of her fingers. He secured it with a heavy brass tack. When he walked back and handed the tool to Esther, he offered no explanation. He just nodded toward the next post. Esther took the maul, her thick fingers wrapping perfectly around the newly customized grip. She looked down at the leather, then up at Gideon's weathered face. Men usually mocked her massive hands or feared them. No man had ever silently adjusted the world to fit her. A profound sense of dignity settled over her. She felt undeniably useful, and more surprisingly, she felt safe. Their peaceful morning was interrupted by approaching hooves. A young clerk from town rode up to the corral. He didn't dismount. He simply leaned down and handed Gideon a sealed envelope, his eyes darting nervously toward Esther's towering frame before he spurred his horse and hurried back down the wagon road. Gideon opened the envelope with his left hand. It was a formal letter from a local land buyer. The offer was insultingly low, barely enough to cover a season's feed. The message was clear. The town knew Gideon's shoulder was failing, they knew winter was coming, and they were waiting for him to lose the property. Gideon folded the paper carefully, his jaw tightening into a hard line. Esther saw the change in his posture. She didn't press him, but walked over to the main corral entrance where a heavy, rusted iron gate hinge was hanging loose from the post. It was a stubborn piece of ironwork Gideon had been meaning to fix. Esther gripped the rusted iron, testing its heavy weight, and managed to force it back into a temporary alignment, securing it with thick wire. "It'll hold for today," she said quietly, offering steady comfort against the rising wind. Gideon nodded, staring past the repaired gate. "The river fence," he muttered. "The river fence is down completely." Esther followed his gaze. The deep river fence line was the only thing standing between their small herd and the deadly frozen bogs to the north. As the bitter wind howled, carrying the scent of an approaching frost, they both knew the terrible truth. They had no usable lumber left on the property. Without that fence, the cattle would wander into the freeze and die. How could they possibly repair 2 miles of heavy timber fencing before the lethal frost arrived, without any wood to build it? The heavy freight wagon rattled over the frozen ruts. Gideon held the reins in his left hand, resting his injured shoulder. Beside him, Esther sat in quiet stillness, her massive shoulders nearly spanning the high seat. The wind whipped her faded green coat, but she seemed unbothered. They had come for necessary supplies, hoping to scavenge enough wire to patch the ruined river fence before the true blizzard hit. As they rolled onto the dirt thoroughfare, the quiet hum of the settlement ceased. Pedestrians stopped walking. Men leaning outside the saloon lowered their tobacco pipes. Esther felt the familiar, heavy weight of their stares. At 6 feet 5 inches, with a muscular build that rivaled a seasoned blacksmith, she knew exactly what they saw. She was a massive aberration in a world that expected women to be small. Gideon halted the team in front of the mercantile. Before Esther could follow him down, a sharp, cruel laugh carried from the shadows of the livery across the street. "Looks like old Gideon finally gave up on horses," a harsh voice muttered. "Went and bought himself a draft monster instead." Another man chuckled. "Bank's gonna take the land anyway. A broken-down cowboy and a circus freak ain't enough to stop the winter." Esther's broad jaw tightened. Her immediate instinct, honed over years of public mockery, was to shrink inward. She lowered her head, hunching her massive shoulders forward, trying to make her enormous frame look smaller. She prepared to wait silently in the wagon, fully expecting Gideon to distance himself from the humiliation she brought him. Instead, Gideon walked deliberately around to her side. He did not look at the men across the street. He looked directly up at Esther and reached out with his good left hand. He didn't offer a rough pull, but a gentleman's steadying grip, a gesture of profound public respect. "Ready, Miss Esther?" His gravelly voice carried clearly across the quiet, frozen street. Surprised by the formal courtesy, she placed her large, calloused hand into his, stepping down with a heavy, grounded thud. Gideon stood tall beside her, his weathered face set in stone. He wasn't hiding her, he was standing shoulder to shoulder with her, silently challenging the town to say another word. They walked into the mercantile together. When the nervous proprietor avoided Esther's gaze, Gideon firmly redirected him. "Miss Esther is keeping the tallies for the winter feed," he said smoothly. "You can give the total to her." The true test came during the loading. A dozen men gathered on the boardwalk, watching to see how the aging cowboy and his giant companion would handle a ton of supplies. The clerk wheeled out a cart stacked with 100-pound sacks of grain and heavy barrels of salted pork. Esther prepared herself for the worst. Men usually tried to prove their own strength around her, hurting themselves in the process, or they treated her like a beast of burden. Gideon did neither. He gripped a massive sack of grain with his left hand, hauled it upright, and nodded to Esther. It was the same look of quiet, practical partnership they shared in the corral. He wasn't using her for a show. He was simply working with his most capable partner. Esther stepped forward. She took the 100-pound sack from him as easily as a pillow, engaging her powerful torso to stack it neatly in the wagon bed. Gideon handed her the next, then a heavy barrel of pork. They fell into a beautiful unspoken rhythm right there on Main Street. Gideon managed the staging while Esther handled the tremendous weight. She didn't have to hide her strength. Gideon was validating her competence in front of the entire town, treating her immense physical power as a deeply respected asset. The mocking whispers on the boardwalk slowly died away, replaced by a sullen, intimidated silence. By the time they finished, Esther's chest was warm with something entirely new. She realized Gideon was actually proud to stand next to her. They drove out of town as the afternoon sun dipped low, casting long shadows over the frozen prairie. The silence between them was no longer just comfortable. It was anchored by an unshakable loyalty. Halfway back to the ranch, Gideon pulled the wagon into a grove of cottonwoods to rest the horses. He built a small fire and pulled the heavy iron coffee pot from his saddlebags, the same one they had shared on her first night. He poured the steaming bitter brew into a tin cup and handed it up to her. Esther wrapped her massive hands around the warm metal, feeling entirely safe. But as she looked back down the trail, she noticed a solitary rider paused on the distant ridge. It was the aggressive land buyer watching them with cold calculation. The town had seen Gideon's failing shoulder, and they had seen the prejudice against Esther's size. As the bitter wind howled, Esther wondered a terrible thought. Would the buyer leverage the town's cruel hatred to finally force Gideon off his land? The Wyoming winter did not arrive with a warning. It arrived with a roar. By midnight, a blinding whiteout had swallowed the ranch. Wind hammered the heavy log walls of the cabin, driving snow through the smallest cracks in the chinking. Inside, the hearth fire burned low, casting long, dancing shadows across the floorboards. Gideon lay in his bedroll near the stove, staring at the ceiling, trying to breathe through a pain so sharp it made his vision blur. The cold, combined with the heavy lifting in town the previous afternoon, had finally exacted its toll. His right shoulder was completely locked. It felt as though a rusted iron spike had been driven deep into the joint. When dawn broke, there was no sunlight, only a pale, bruised gray pressing against the frosted windows. Gideon tried to sit up. A ragged gasp escaped his chest as his arm refused to support his weight. For a man who had spent 30 years breaking green horses and throwing calves in the spring dirt, the sudden inability to even pull on his own boots was a crushing humiliation. He gritted his teeth, throwing his legs over the side of the cot, his left hand fumbling weakly with his canvas trousers. From the other side of the cabin, Esther watched him quietly. She'd already been awake for an hour, feeding the cast iron stove and melting snow. She did not rush over with frantic pity, knowing instinctively how much a proud cattleman hated to be fussed over. Instead, she walked to the corner, picked up the heavy, rusted iron gate hinge they had temporarily wired together, and brought it to the hearth. She sat on a sturdy stool, taking up a wire brush and a rag soaked in harness oil, giving Gideon space to fight his own battle, but the battle was already lost. Gideon tried to reach for his flannel shirt hanging on the back of a wooden chair, but his right arm simply would not move. He stopped, his broad shoulders slumping in absolute defeat. The silence in the small cabin stretched out, heavy and thick with an unspoken realization. Esther set the heavy iron hinge on the floor. She walked over, her massive frame moving with surprising quietness. "Let me help," she said softly. Her voice carried no pity, only a steady, practical warmth. Gideon did not argue. He couldn't. He sat perfectly still as Esther picked up the heavy flannel shirt. Her hands were enormous, calloused from years of brutal frontier labor, built for hoisting timber and managing heavy draft horses. Yet, as she carefully guided his injured arm through the sleeve, her touch was incredibly gentle. She did not jostle his shoulder. She moved with a precise, tender caution that brought a sudden tightness to Gideon's throat. She fetched a bucket of snow she had heated on the stove, soaking a clean wool cloth in the steaming water. "Keep still," she murmured, wringing out the hot cloth and pressing it firmly against his inflamed joint. The intense heat sank into his aching muscles, pulling a long, shuddering sigh from his chest. He closed his eyes, finally surrendering the fierce independence that had kept him entirely alone for years. It was terrifying to let another person see his physical weakness, but the quiet strength in Esther's presence made him feel safe. "I'm sorry," Gideon rasped, his voice rough with emotion. He opened his eyes, looking up at her weathered, capable face. "I've been a stubborn fool, trying to hide how bad this shoulder was getting. I'm used to carrying the weight myself, no matter how heavy it gets." "I appreciate your care, Esther. I truly do." It was a massive admission, one that cost him his last ounce of cowboy pride. Esther smiled softly, a rare softening of her broad, strong jaw. She adjusted the hot compress, then returned to the hearth. She picked up the rusted iron gate hinge again, applying the heavy oil and scrubbing away the years of decay with steady, powerful strokes of the wire brush. It was a comforting sound against the howling wind outside, a rhythm of patiently mending something that had been broken for a very long time. Later that afternoon, as Esther searched the high shelf above the stove for dry tea leaves, her large hand accidentally brushed against a small, dented tin box hidden behind a row of coffee tins. It slid forward, knocking against the timber wall and revealing the edge of a heavy, folded property deed tucked beneath a brass latch. At the sound of the metal scraping the wood, Gideon flinched, his posture instantly turning rigid. He turned his face away, staring fiercely into the dying fire, his jaw locked in sudden defensive tension. "Leave that box be," he commanded quietly, his voice tight with a profound pain that had absolutely nothing to do with his shoulder. Esther carefully stepped back, leaving the tin box untouched, but her mind raced as the blizzard raged outside. What terrible ghost was hiding in that ledger? And why did Gideon refuse to even look at the land he was fighting so hard to save? The howling wind finally died shortly before dawn, leaving behind a profound, ringing silence. Sunlight pierced the frosted window panes, casting brilliant white beams across the floorboards. Gideon's shoulder still ached with a deep, bruised heat, but the fiery joint lock had eased enough for him to move his arm a few inches. He stood near the cast-iron stove, his breath steady as he gripped the heavy iron handle of the coffee pot with his left hand. He carefully poured the steaming, bitter brew into 2 tin cups. Slowly, respectfully, he carried the first cup to the wooden table and set it down in front of Esther. She looked up from the heavy wool socks she was darning, wrapping her massive hands around the warm metal. It was a simple domestic ritual, but the quiet care behind it made the cold cabin feel remarkably like a home. For a brief moment, the desperate reality of their situation faded, replaced by the quiet vision of a shared future, but the frontier rarely allowed for long illusions. The storm had broken, but the cattle were undoubtedly scattered, and the winter feed had to be calculated before they could determine if the herd would survive. While Gideon carefully pulled on his heavy coat to assess the immediate damage to the barn, Esther offered to review the ranch accounts. She opened the heavy leather-bound ledger on the table, carefully turning the brittle pages. Her large fingers traced the columns of feed costs, tallying the grain against the projected winter months. But as she reached the back of the book, a loose sheet of folded paper slipped from the binding. It was a formal notice from the territorial bank. Esther unfolded it, her brow furrowing as she read the staggering numbers. Gideon was not just struggling to feed his cattle, he was drowning in a massive balloon note, a crushing financial burden secured against the deed of the land itself. The original signature at the bottom did not belong to Gideon. It belonged to his late father. When Gideon walked back into the cabin, stamping snow from his boots, he froze. He saw the open ledger and the bank notice resting in Esther's large hand. The easy, comfortable silence of the morning shattered instantly. "That wasn't meant for your eyes," Gideon said, his voice rough and defensive. He walked over and took the paper, folding it sharply. "You're paying a dead man's debt," Esther said quietly, refusing to be intimidated by his sudden anger. "The feed isn't what's pulling this ranch under, Gideon. It's a ghost." Gideon's jaw tightened. "My father bled to keep this valley. He fought the winters, he fought the rustlers, and he fought the bank. I stood by his grave and promised I wouldn't let the land go. A man does not break his word to his family." Esther looked at his weathered, exhausted face. She understood loyalty, but she also recognized a losing battle. A cold, familiar loneliness began to creep back into her chest. She had foolishly allowed herself to feel safe here, to believe they were building a partnership. But Gideon wasn't looking toward the future. He was chained completely to the past. If he was willing to work himself to death for a ghost, there was no real place for her in his life. She quietly closed the ledger, pulling her emotional walls back up. The tension between them remained heavy as they waded out into the deep, blinding snow to check the near pastures. The drifts were waist-high in places, the air biting and sharp. Near the frozen creek, they spotted a 400-pound weanling calf that had wandered away from the main herd. It was standing belly-deep in a drift, bawling miserably, entirely stuck. Gideon uncoiled his lariat, but his right shoulder was still too weak to throw a proper loop. He tried twice, wincing in pain as the rope fell short. The calf, spooked by the splashing snow, began to thrash, wedging itself deeper into the frozen mud. Esther did not wait for him to try a third time. She simply waded into the drift, her massive, powerful legs breaking the heavy snow with ease. The panicked calf tried to bolt, slipping sideways, but Esther just reached down and calmly wrapped her enormous arms around its thick torso. She didn't struggle. She engaged her broad shoulders, heaved the furious animal out of the drift, and casually carried the kicking, bawling calf back to solid ground, setting it down gently on the packed trail. Gideon watched her dust the snow from her apron. He looked at the ridiculous calf, then up at Esther's stoic face. A slow, genuine chuckle rumbled in his chest, breaking through his bitter pride. The chuckle turned into a rich, tired laugh. Esther tried to maintain her stern expression, but the corners of her mouth betrayed her, breaking into a warm, reluctant smile. The heavy tension evaporated into the freezing air, reminding them both of what a remarkable team they made. But as they walked the herd back to the pens, the shadow of the ledger fell over Gideon once more. The final banknote was due before the first of the year. The cattle they had left wouldn't cover half of it. He looked toward the barn, his mind turning to a desperate thought. What was he willing to sacrifice to keep the bank away for one more winter? The deep winter freeze had hardened the Wyoming mud into iron, making every chore on the ranch an act of sheer endurance. The mid-morning sun was blindingly bright against the snow crust, but it offered absolutely no warmth. Down at the lower holding pens, Esther pushed a heavy timber gate shut. The rusted iron hinge she had cleaned and oiled by the hearth fire swung smoothly, bearing the tremendous weight of the wood without a single groan. She dropped the heavy iron latch into place, her breath pluming in the frigid air, and looked over at Gideon. Gideon stood near the fence line, his right arm resting stiffly against his heavy coat. The deep ache in his shoulder was still present, but the fiery joint lock had subsided thanks to the hot compresses Esther had faithfully applied over the past few days. He was tallying the surviving herd, his weathered face drawn tight with a quiet, persistent worry. The cattle had survived the blizzard, but they were thin, and there simply were not enough of them to cover the looming balloon note his father had left behind. The crunch of hooves on frozen snow broke the morning stillness. Two riders were coming down the wagon road from town. Gideon recognized them immediately. The man in front, wearing a thick buffalo coat and a smug expression, was Vance, the aggressive land buyer who had been circling the property for a year. Beside him rode the town's bank manager, looking nervous and distinctly uncomfortable in the bitter wind. Vance did not bother to dismount when he reached the edge of the corral. He looked down at Gideon from the saddle, his eyes immediately dropping to Gideon's stiff right shoulder. "Morning, Gideon," Vance called out, his voice sharp and carrying easily on the wind. "Looks like the storm hit you hard." "The bank manager and I rode out to save you a long, painful trip into town. We both know the final note on this property is due in 3 weeks. We also know you do not have the cattle to cover it." Gideon remained perfectly still, his blue eyes fixed coldly on the rider. "State your business, Vance." "I am offering you a clean way out," Vance said smoothly, pulling a folded document from his heavy coat pocket. "Sign the deed over to me today. I will assume the remaining debt, the bank gets made whole, and I will even give you enough cash to buy a one-way train ticket to somewhere warmer. It is a generous offer for a broken-down cowboy who can not even swing a lariat anymore." Gideon's jaw locked. He felt the familiar, heavy weight of his family's ghost pressing down on him. Before he could speak, Vance's gaze shifted past him, landing directly on Esther. She had just hoisted a frozen 50-pound sack of grain onto her broad shoulder as if it were a light feather pillow. She stood 6 feet 5 inches tall, her massive, naturally muscular frame radiating a quiet, grounded power that made the two riders look fragile by comparison. Vance let out a harsh, mocking laugh. I heard the rumors in town, but I did not believe them. I see why you have not frozen to death yet, Gideon. Though I am surprised a proud man like you stooped to keeping a circus freak to do his chores. I suppose she is the only draft animal you have got left. The silence that followed was absolute and terrifying. Esther slowly lowered the sack of grain to the packed snow. For years, she had endured the cruelty of small-minded men. She had learned to shrink inward, to hide her strength, and to walk away. But as she stood in the freezing corral, she felt a sudden, fierce refusal to be diminished on this land. She stepped forward, her heavy boots crunching loudly in the snow. Her massive presence was so physically intimidating that Vance's horse flattened its ears and danced nervously backward. Esther could have easily pulled the man from his saddle with one hand. Instead, she stopped a few paces away. She looked at Gideon, waiting for his lead, respecting his authority on the ranch. Gideon did not draw his sidearm. He did not shout. He simply walked forward, placing himself deliberately between the mounted men and Esther. When he spoke, his gravelly voice was low, steady, and vibrating with a dangerous, quiet rage. You will close your mouth, Vance, Gideon said softly. This is Miss Esther. She is not a hired hand, and she is certainly not an animal. She is my equal partner in the operations of this ranch. You will address her with the respect she has earned, or I will drag you off that horse myself, bad shoulder and all. Vance stared at the aging cattleman, his smug smile vanishing entirely. He looked at Gideon's hardened face, then up at Esther's towering, immovable frame. The bank manager cleared his throat nervously, adjusting his reins. The offer is rejected, Gideon continued, never breaking eye contact. The note is not due until the new year. Now get off our land, Vance sneered, yanking his horse around. You are a fool, Gideon. You will freeze and the bank will take it all anyway. The two men spurred their horses, riding hard back up the frozen trail. Esther stood in the snow, her chest tight with an entirely new emotion. Gideon had not just defended her dignity, he had claimed her as his equal. He had called it our land. She walked back to the corral entrance and swung the heavy timber gate shut. The repaired iron hinge held firm and unyielding against the post. The ranch was physically secure, and for the first time in her life, Esther felt like she truly belonged somewhere. But as she watched Gideon staring out at their small, shivering herd, the grim reality settled over them both. Gideon had fiercely defended their home, but the deadline was real. How could he possibly pay the massive banknote in 3 weeks without selling the very land they were standing on? The bitter Wyoming freeze broke 2 days later, replaced by a warm, howling Chinook wind that carried a torrential winter rain. The sudden thaw was a rancher's worst nightmare. By mid-afternoon, the frozen river had violently swelled, sending massive, jagged chunks of ice rushing downstream. The deep roar of the rising floodwater echoed off the canyon walls, audible even inside the cabin. Gideon and Esther rushed down the muddy wagon trail through the driving rain. When they reached the lower draw, Gideon's heart sank into his boots. The flash flood had bypassed the high banks, pooling rapidly in the depression where their remaining herd was huddled for shelter. The only thing keeping the terrified cattle from being swept into the deadly rushing main current was the heavy timber river fence. But a massive ice jam had backed up against the barrier. As they watched, the thick center support post cracked with a sound like a rifle shot. The primary crossbeam sagged violently, dipping into the freezing water. If that barrier collapsed, the entire herd would be washed away, taking Gideon's final chance to save the ranch with them. Esther did not wait for instructions. She stripped off her heavy canvas coat, throwing it onto the muddy bank, and waded directly into the freezing, waist-deep water. "Esther, no!" Gideon shouted over the roar of the flood, his voice frantic. "The current is too strong!" She ignored him, pushing through the churning ice until she reached the sagging center of the broken barrier. The massive, waterlogged timber was groaning under the immense pressure of the blocked river. Esther planted her heavy boots deep into the rocky riverbed, widening her grounded stance. She ducked her head, wedging her incredibly broad, powerful shoulders directly underneath the collapsing crossbeam. She took a deep, shuddering breath, gripped the thick wood with her enormous hands, and drove upward. Her massive legs trembled as she absorbed a tremendous weight that would have crushed any ordinary person. Slowly, agonizingly, the heavy timber rose from the freezing water. Esther's thick, functional muscles locked into place, her entire body becoming the structural pillar the fence desperately needed. She held the immense burden against the raging current, creating a temporary, stable gap along the high bank. "Move them!" Esther roared, her voice vibrating over the crashing water. Gideon spurred into action. Using his good arm, he swung his lariat, shouting and driving the panicked cattle up the muddy embankment through the narrow opening she had secured. He worked with desperate speed, moving dozens of terrified animals to the safety of the high ridge. But as the last few stragglers balked at the rushing water, a fresh surge of debris slammed into the barrier. Esther was driven to one knee, the freezing water surging dangerously close to her chest. Gideon dropped his rope instantly. He abandoned the remaining cattle without a second thought. He slid down the treacherous mud bank, reaching out over the raging water with his left hand. He was not looking at his livelihood. He was looking at the woman he realized he could not live without. "Let it go, Esther," Gideon screamed, sheer terror ripping through his chest. "I don't care about the herd. Give me your hand." Esther looked up at his desperate, rain-slicked face. She heaved upward one final time, violently shoving the massive beam away, and lunged toward the bank. The timber collapsed behind her with a deafening crash, the flood instantly swallowing the space where she had just been kneeling. Gideon caught her thick forearm, hauling her massive frame out of the mud and freezing water with every ounce of strength he possessed. They collapsed onto the wet grass together, gasping for air, the surviving cattle safely grazing on the ridge above them. An hour later, back inside the warm cabin, the fire was roaring. Esther sat shivering on the hearthstone, wrapped in 3 heavy wool blankets, drinking the hot coffee Gideon had pressed into her hands. Gideon walked to the mantel. He reached behind the coffee tins and pulled down the small, dented tin box. He did not turn away this time. He opened the latch, pulled out the heavy property deed, and placed it quietly on the table beside her. Esther stared at it. Stamped boldly across the territorial banknote in heavy black ink were the words, "Paid in full." "I don't understand," Esther whispered, her voice rough. "The cattle haven't been sold. When we went into town for grain, I didn't just go to the mercantile," Gideon said quietly, taking a seat beside her. "I went to the livery. I sold my father's silver-mounted custom saddle and his matched driving horses. I wired the funds directly to the territorial capital. The deed cleared the mail yesterday. Vance didn't know the local manager had already lost the debt." Esther looked at him in shock. "You sold your father's legacy. You let his ghost go." "I did." Gideon nodded, his blue eyes softening as he looked at her, "because I realized I wasn't defending a graveyard anymore. For the first time in my life, I wanted a future." Esther looked down at the stamped paper, her heart pounding against her ribs. She'd spent her entire life believing she was nothing more than a beast of burden. Could a woman who had always been treated as a massive, unwanted obligation finally accept that she was the very reason this man had fought so hard to stay? The crackling hearth fire cast a warm, dancing glow across the small log cabin, but the real heat bloomed deep within Esther's chest. She sat perfectly still on the hearthstone, her massive shoulders rising and falling with heavy, uneven breaths. Her thick fingers trembled slightly as she held the stamped property deed. Paid in full. For her entire life, she had navigated a frontier world that had no place for a woman built on her tremendous scale. She had been feared, stared at, mocked, and expected to earn her keep through brute physical labor. Men had always looked at her immense frame and seen nothing more than a beast of burden. But Gideon had looked at her and seen a future. Gideon watched her quietly from the wooden chair beside the table. He did not rush her. He understood the heavy emotional walls she had built to survive the cruelties of the Western Territory, and he knew exactly how terrifying it was for her to finally lower them. "You gave up the last pieces of your father," Esther whispered, her voice thick with unshed emotion, tracing the heavy black ink of the bank stamp. His custom silver-mounted saddle, his matched driving team. That was his absolute pride, Gideon. That was his history. "No, Esther," Gideon replied, his gravelly voice remarkably steady. "This land is the history. The rest was just carved leather and horseflesh. I would have lost this land too if I hadn't finally realized what it was actually meant for." He stood up, walking over to the hearth. He did not kneel. His weathered knees were too old for grand theatrical gestures. But he sat beside her on the wide stone ledge. He reached out and gently rested his left hand over her massive, calloused hands. He didn't try to encompass them. He simply held them with quiet reverence, tracing the scarred knuckles that had literally held back the freezing flood. "I was holding onto a ghost because I thought it was the only thing I had left," Gideon said softly. "But then a broken freight wagon axle brought you down my road. You didn't just mend my winter fences, Esther. You mended the foundation of this place. Vance called you a draft animal, but he is a blind, foolish man. You are the strongest, most dignified woman I have ever known. I don't want you to stay in this valley as a hired hand. I am asking you to stay as my equal partner, as my wife. If you will have a stubborn, graying cattleman who finally learned he doesn't have to carry the heavy weight alone." Esther looked into his observant blue eyes. There was no pity there, no hidden intimidation, and no desire to tame her. There was only absolute, unshakable respect. A warm tear slipped down her weathered cheek, a quiet release of decades of public mockery and private loneliness. She turned her enormous hands over, gently wrapping her thick fingers around his, feeling the familiar calluses of a man who truly understood hard work. "I will stay," she rumbled softly, her voice filled with a profound peace. "We will carry the weight together." 3 weeks later, the brutal Wyoming blizzard season settled into a crisp winter cold. The morning sky over the eastern ridge was a brilliant, bruised purple, giving way to the pale gold of dawn. Down at the lower holding pens, the heavy timber corral gate swung smoothly and completely silent on the oiled, repaired iron hinge. The surviving herd was feeding peacefully on the winter hay they had carefully rationed, entirely safe from the frozen river bogs. Gideon stood by the cast iron stove inside the main cabin, his right arm moving with much greater ease. The fiery lock in his shoulder had faded to a manageable ache, healed by weeks of hot compresses, rest, and Esther's quiet insistence that he allow her to manage the heaviest timber. He reached out, gripping the heavy iron handle of the simmering coffee pot, and poured the steaming, bitter brew into 2 battered tin cups. He carried them out onto the covered wooden porch. Esther was already standing there, dressed in her heavy dark green canvas coat, her broad shoulders completely relaxed as she surveyed the frost-covered valley. Gideon stepped up beside her, handing her the warm metal cup. She took it with a gentle nod, her massive fingers brushing comfortably against his. They did not need to speak. The desperate, frantic labor of the autumn was finished, replaced by the quiet, steady rhythm of shared domestic life. Gideon did not feel diminished standing beside a woman who was taller and physically stronger than he was. His own courage was amplified by her presence. Esther no longer hunched her heavy shoulders or tried to make herself appear small. She stood at her full, towering height, completely secure in the knowledge that she was loved exactly as she was built. They stood shoulder to shoulder on the wooden floorboards, drinking their bitter frontier coffee in the freezing air, watching the morning sun rise over the beautiful, unforgiving land they had saved together. This story is a fictional work created for entertainment. Its characters, places, and events are imaginary or creatively adapted. It does not depict any real living person.